Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Back in the Day podcast, Metro Archive's lively series all about Nashville's culture and history. This is Metro Archive's program coordinator, Sarah Arntz, and today we're joined by a special guest who will shed light on one of U.S. history's most fascinating, yet notorious, figures, famously known as the Kingfish. If you're thinking of Louisiana politician Huey Long and wondering how this connects to Nashville history, aside from the fact that Tennessee native and Vandy grad Robert Penn Warren wrote a novel based on him, don't worry, we'll get you there. It's a very cool story, actually, especially for sports fans like myself. But first, let me introduce our guest, author Thomas Patterson. Thomas Patterson is a Chicago attorney and founder of the Patterson Law Firm, LLC. He previously served as a law clerk for Justice William G. Clark of the Illinois Supreme Court. In 2024, Patterson published the book American Populist, Huey Long of Louisiana. Before writing this biography, he authored the article Mastering the Senate Maze, Mr. Long Goes to Washington, published in the Louisiana History, the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association, summer of 2022. So welcome, Mr. Patterson.
Well, thanks for having me.
So to start us off, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up writing this biography.
Let's talk about Huey first.
Sure.
He was a fascinating guy, as you mentioned.
Yes.
He had victories, defeats, comebacks. He had lots of conflicts with the bank in town, with his brother and his other family members, with the Louisiana oligarchy, and ultimately with Franklin Roosevelt, the IRS, and the FBI on the national scene. So he had everything that you learned about in 8th grade English class about conflicts making for a good story, and so he certainly had that. He also lived in interesting times. You had the robber baron period, you had World War I, you had the Roaring '20s, and you had the worst, the greatest, the weirdest, the Great Depression in the United States history. So, as I told one audience, if I wrote a bad book, it's all my fault because I had a lot of good material to work with. I've been a lawyer for a long time. As you mentioned, I was a law clerk for an Illinois Supreme Court judge. And then I started at a big firm, and then I started my own firm in the year 2000. In 2009, I wrote a book for lawyers about preliminary injunctions and temporary restraining orders. I'm sure that's a mouthful, and I'm sure most of the people don't know what that means, but it's important for lawyers. And so I thought that, hey, it took me about 3 years to write the book for lawyers, so I thought, well, I can analyze Huey, and there were some questions I had in my mind that were outstanding. The financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 brought to the fore the potential for redistributing wealth, which was Huey's primary contention, and which had kind of disappeared from view in the preceding 50 years. And so I thought, well, I'll take 3 years and write another book and see how that goes. And, of course, that was in 2014. So it took me a little longer than I thought. So I had always had an interest in history. I was a history major in undergrad school, took a year off to be a salesman, then went to law school, then was a clerk, and then started at a big firm, and I've been litigating cases ever since. Okay. By the way, it's very nice to be back in Nashville. My son was stationed at Fort Campbell for 4 years.
Oh, wow.
And we had our pre-wedding party dinner at the Catbird Seat, I think. Is that still?
I've heard of that.
Is that still open?
It might be. I'm not sure where it's at, but I've heard of it.
It was a nice, very nice restaurant, and very expensive. And he had his wedding reception at Belle Meade Bourbon Distillery. Right? So it was
very nice.
Quite a treat to come to Nashville.
Very good.
And it's quite a treat to come back to Nashville now.
Nice. Well, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Very good. And it kind of sounds like your background a little bit's not too far off from his, with how he was a salesman and to becoming a lawyer too. So it's pretty cool. I can see the connection. So, and I also remember reading in your book, you mentioned that, there's plenty of other biographies and whatnot written about him. Yeah. But what was it really, I guess, that you were like, I think I'm going to see if I can figure out another angle on his lifestyle maybe?
Yeah, it's hard to say. There was a confluence of factors. The ideas that I mentioned, the financial crisis and the resurrection of his ideas, that was one. T. Harry Williams wrote a great biography back in 1969, won the Pulitzer Prize and deserved it. But there were subsequent biographies that took a more negative tact about Huey. And there were also writers and thesis writers who took different slices of his story and expanded on it. So there's a book about his Arkansas campaign. There was a book about the cotton crisis. There was a thesis about his relationship with Franklin Roosevelt and the politics of relief, a spectacular study. There were thesis writers about the oil industry. And I'm sure, and there was a great book by Alan Brinkley about his national impact and his story there. So in one sense, I just had to bring all of these subsequent studies from Williams on and kind of collect them in one group. And I thought that if I analyzed the primary sources, I could reconcile the disagreements among the historians and satisfy my own curiosity.
Oh, very good.
But, one interesting thing is that the internet was indispensable to the book. So you had, I got the Chicago Tribune's articles for 7 years, every article that mentioned Huey. And I could pull that from the internet or digitization and then just, had a secretary photocopy it, and I could go day by day by day. And I did the same thing with the New York Times. And so that, I think, is to me anyway, a far superior way of researching than relying on scrapbooks, which may or may not get articles. And so, plus all the newspapers and libraries now are crumbling. It's very hard to read. You feel like you're destroying the evidence, as you go through it. But,
yeah, we feel the same.
But what I was surprised about was I knew that his personal papers, had been discovered after Williams's book.
Okay.
But what I didn't realize is that subsequent biographers hadn't really used them much. And so I was able to look at lots of papers relating to correspondence with his family members, business people, law cases, and that was very, very interesting and allowed me to supplement and answer some questions that even I had after reading Williams's book. So,
I mean, being an archivist, I believe primary sources are the best thing you're going to go with because you're going to get your own interpretation, really. So completely unaltered.
You and I must be a little bit weird, right, to get this satisfaction of looking at these ancient materials. I was sitting in Tulane's library. It's very, very quiet, right? Just a few people scribbling notes and, with their magnifying glasses out and so on. And I'm reading the papers by a newspaperman at the time of Huey, and he had a big collection in the Tulane library. And all of a sudden, I see that in one of Huey's campaigns in Arkansas, he had a stenographer record the whole live speech. And so I'm sitting there in this very quiet, staid room going, yes!
I'm sure the librarians love that.
And everybody, looks up for a moment, looks around, and then goes back to work. So.
That's pretty funny. I like that. I mean, as much research as we've done, and when we're going through process and collections, you have so many of those moments of being like, does anybody else see this? This is fascinating. Right. I totally get it. And then reading from his own papers. How long did it take you 3 years to write the book? Was that research and
that
writing?
Was my law book only took me 3 years. Oh. This one, right, I started working in 2014, or at least my first draft of the first chapter is, I think, September of 2014. Then it's not published until, actually, it was published February of this year, February 15th of 2025. So we're looking at 10 years, right?
That is dedication.
And I had never had any appreciation for what it was like to be pregnant before.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, I mean, it's a very well-written book.
Thank you. Too kind.
It was written very much like, I know if anybody's, I'm sure you have read any of Eric Larson's books, like The Devil in the White City. The way he writes when it comes to history, it's very fiction-esque. So to me, that's how yours was it was very easy to follow, and so much information down to the details, too, of even how you grew up and everything. Yeah.
Well, the Devil book is supposed to be a spectacular book, and it's on my list of things to read. Especially because it involves Chicago.
I've read a couple of his books, and they're all very fascinating. He must spend that much time doing the research on all that, too, because he gets down into the details like how you did, too. So it's like, how did you know these things? It's like how he grew up and everything. Like Huey, when you're describing his family and the relationships he had with his brothers and stuff, like what part of his primary sources did you find the information about his earliest life?
His own letters.
Oh, his own letters. Okay. Yeah. I was curious about that.
And like, for example, even years later, he wrote to his old boss at a newspaper saying, "Oh, I remember the days when I worked for 11 hours for 75 cents and a plug of tobacco." So like, that tells me how much he was paid. I didn't know that before, and that he took up tobacco at a young age.
Wow. Because he was such a busy, successful, and charismatic character and often disliked, what stands out most to you about his life or his career or both?
Yeah, that's a great question, number one. And it's hard to detail it to only one thing.
Sure.
But I would say what struck me the most was his willingness to face down ridicule or reprimands, his ability to risk everything on an almost constant basis. And then he was able to get things done.
Mm.
And so I've got chapter titles with those things in it because I thought they were significant. And if you look at those factors, you can see how they apply to later events. And it's like, now those aren't the only characteristics that made him successful, in my opinion, but they are three of the key components of his success, in my view. Let's look at one of them, getting things done. So that implicates not only that he had a let's get it done mindset, right? Execution, as the business people today would call it, but also that he framed solutions to problems.
Okay.
And that he didn't just frame a solution that was pie in the sky or apt not to result in what he wanted, but was actually set forth in order to benefit his class of constituents. So, for example, when he was railroad commissioner, he proposed making pipelines common carriers, and that was a substantial benefit to independent oil drillers who otherwise could be frozen out by the big oil companies who owned the pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had a case against a telephone company where he forced that telephone company to issue rebate checks of totaling something like $450,000, $460,000 to about 80,000 Louisiana consumers of telephones. And I think even people that didn't have telephones at the time would have appreciated a public servant forcing a big telephone company represented by the biggest and most famous lawyers in the state to issue actual refund checks to telephone owners.
Right.
And so he concentrated on those kinds of achievable solutions. Then when he became governor, he wanted highways and bridges and a new governor's mansion, a new state capitol, tallest building in the South at the time,
Wow.
and a new airport. And then once those improvements were brought forth, then he changed his focus or supplemented his focus to expand Louisiana State University. And he began with something an instinctive politician would begin with, the band and the football team. And if you think about it, even later writers in, I forget, it was Fortune or Forbes magazine, have discussed that is a smart thing for a school to do. And Huey was doing it back in 1931, 32, 33.
Revolutionary.
And so he obtained public support for the school, started the football mania. I mean, if you look at they call it Death Valley down in Baton Rouge now for the football games. Yeah. And because the whole town turns out for the games, and they're spectacular. Huey started that. Huey started that.
Mm-hmm.
But he not only did the showmanship type things, he brought Robert Penn Warren. I mean, not him personally, but the administration brought Robert Penn Warren and many other first-rate professors down to LSU, and they expanded the curriculum substantially and grew the population substantially, and they built a lot of new buildings down there too. So it was kind of a coordinated approach. He started a new medical school. Before that, Tulane had the only medical school. He started a medical school at LSU, and the populations of both schools expanded thereafter. So you basically doubled the South's supply of doctors by that decision. So
pretty significant.
But anyway, I'm a little bit down the road of framing, right? But my point is that he didn't concentrate on issues that may have been satisfying to his constituents but couldn't result in any benefit. And so there's actually, when you're tailoring your potential solution, you also have to keep in mind the potential execution of that. And he did. And so he got a lot of things done. He obtained the support for it. He had the consensus for it. And so it was a kind of a coordinated package that a lot of, say, the populists haven't. In other words, if you look at Joe McCarthy, for example, I think he was considered a kind of a populist leader. And, his idea was the communists were threatening America, or the American dream, as I like to say. But he didn't have the list of communists that he said he had.
Yeah.
And whatever actual infiltration had conducted was pretty minuscule and ineffective. And so at the end of the day, he would be very entertaining. He got a lot of support. But what was actually done? What did he actually accomplish? And it's hard to see. Whereas Huey, you had the rabble-rousing aspects of it, You had the showmanship aspects of it. You had the appeal to the people aspects of it. You had the American dream aspects of it. But you also had tangible benefits that he supplied once he obtained the consensus in support of his program.
Right.
So anyway, that's a long answer, but it's
it's a good answer.
it's the ridicule. He could avoid the ridicule. I mean, I could tell you stories. Well, there was in the book.
Yeah.
Right. He got ridiculed by his old boss as a salesman. He got ridiculed by the legislature when he appeared there to advocate for workers' compensation reform. He got reprimanded by a judge, and he said in his autobiography, "To the devil with a reprimand. I'm trying to clear my client," and that was his attitude.
It was. He was going to get results. I mean, I admire that, I guess. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
I thought there were some things to admire about him. You know, he had an exuberance about life that we'll get to when we talk about the Nashville excursion.
Right.
But he had an exuberance about life, and he put himself out there, and he wanted to make an impact on the world.
Right.
And he wasn't just a leaf on the stream of life floating through life, you know. He actually wanted to make an impact and did.
There was one thing that that you were talking about in the book that he does that I actually kind of do similarly, and I'm sure I'm not the only person that does this, but the fact that he did so much reading and then he would write down quotes from his books. I have a list in my phone of all the quotes I find, then I just collect them over time because
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Because I was surprised.
You really? Okay.
Yes, because Glenn Johnson, who wrote a book about Huey called Messiah of the Masses, he had said Huey didn't study. He relied on intuition and a superficial understanding of the facts. And that's just not true. Okay. I mean, he read substantially. And so I was shocked. Having read the Johnson book, I was shocked to see that Huey had abstracts of these sentences in his papers. And then you looked at his law school abstracts, as I mentioned in the book. I mean, his constitutional law abstract was on 8.5 by 14-inch paper, single-spaced, and it was 22 pages long.
Yeah, those were the ones that his wife would dictate for him? Yeah. Oh, my.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, he even had some of the headings were in red, typed, right? Red. So
yeah.
It's very interesting. But he studied, and that was something that I think wasn't appreciated by everyone.
Yeah, I mean, he backed up what he did pretty much. He had the knowledge for it. He worked for it. And
you think about, people say, well, he's a genius. And I think there's a tendency to say, well, so-and-so's a genius, and therefore they're set apart from everybody. And I don't deny that. I think he was probably a genius, although you have to wonder how to define it and so on. But the fact that he studied makes him, I think, more accessible to people like me. And
True.
You just, it's not that, well, I'm not a genius, so therefore, I have to sit there and be satisfied with my lot in life. If you study and pursue things and have the energy to achieve your goals, well, then you can do that.
Yeah, that's exactly what he did. And especially, took him a couple tries for law school, but he got it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, where does the nickname Kingfish come from? I think I watched Ken Burns' documentary, and they say he gave it to himself, but then I also have heard others. So where does that come from?
Well, there's kind of a mystery about it. Obviously, there was the Amos and Andy radio show at the time, which was very popular at the time, and there was the Kingfish was a character on that show who was kind of the head of the lodge, but kind of a conniving fictional character. And so one story was that Huey and his friends were sitting around the radio talking and arguing about something, and Huey all of a sudden exclaimed, "Shut up, you sons of bitches, shut up. This is the Kingfish talking." Right? That's one story. Another story was that they were selling highway bonds for his highway program, and somebody pointed out that under the language of the statute, the highway department had to sign these bonds, not the governor. And so he said, "Well, gentlemen, I'm participating here anyway, and you can just call me the Kingfish, and that'll be my participation." And so he had applied that nickname derisively to others, and so when he applied it to himself, it kind of stuck, and he made no effort to discourage it after that, and even asked some people to call him the Kingfish. I don't know exactly why, but he said it was an easier name than Long to understand over the telephone. So,
I could see that. Okay.
You
that
can see
sense.
it a little bit, right? Kingfish. So,
yeah.
So it was homespun majesty, I think, is what T. Harry Williams called it. And I think it had that kind of resonance with people. And it also hooked into his song later, right? "Every Man a King" was his slogan when he started the Share Our Wealth plan, and he had a song by that title that he wrote the words for. Okay. So Kingfish, "Every Man a King."
I gotcha. Okay. Well, that explains it a little bit. Early in the book, you highlight how Huey built his reputation as someone both admired and disliked. You also share some of the more infamous and almost unbelievable things he did, like subsidizing all LSU students to travel to Nashville for a football game. Before we get into the actual story, because it is great, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the wilder things he did? You list quite a few of them.
Yeah, and they were so much fun to write. So after he became governor, there was a German commander of a ship who docked in New Orleans and decided to play a courtesy call on the governor, and that was Huey. And he had either been working all night or listening to a radio sermon. So he greeted the commander in his bathrobe, green pajamas, and slippers, looking, one reporter said, like an explosion in a paint factory. And so the commander seemed to be fine, but his first assistant or adjutant or whatever you call him, was quite upset and called one of Huey's people and say, "How dare you insult the commander like that?" And they ultimately arranged a trip out to the ship where Huey borrowed formal clothes, swallowtail coat and all that kind of stuff, and went out there and they had a 21-gun salute and they were fine. So Huey wrote a letter apologizing, saying that, "Look, I was born in the sticks of Winfield, up in the country. We don't know anything about international courtesies or exchanges of diplomacy." And he said, "It was only by accident that I happened to get more votes than the other people aspiring to the office of governor."
He had humility.
Yeah. So if you think about it, it's kind of a Ben Franklin type of sardonic humor,
Right.
I think. So he got quite a bit of publicity from that. And in one of his campaign stops in another state a few years later, he stopped at a restaurant, and all the waiters dressed up in green pajamas in honor of that episode and served them dinner.
Gosh. It'd be great if there was a photo of that somewhere.
Right. And there was another incident. Have you ever had pot liquor?
I have not. And I remember reading you describe it, but I couldn't.
It's the broth left over from cooking greens and salt pork.
I see.
It's, I guess, healthful, but in my view, it's a bit of an acquired taste.
Mm.
But it was a staple food of rural Southerners, black and white, and it's eaten with corn pone biscuit, flour, and baked into a hard patty. And so he was just talking one day and decided to expound upon pot liquor as a healthful food, beneficial to people, and so on. And he decided that he would invent a more stylish way of eating it. Instead of people would crumble the corn pone into the soup broth, but he said you're supposed to dunk it and then have the corn pone and eat the soup that way. So somehow his description came to the attention of the Atlanta Constitution food editor, a guy named Julian Harris. And Harris wrote back a telegram or a column in his paper saying that Huey was all wrong, that the only way to eat it was to crumble it. And then he accused Huey in a mock serious tone of crumbling in private, right? So then Huey matched his telegram, said he had never crumbled in private except to demonstrate the faults of the technique to a few of his closest friends. So from there, the controversy took off. And for about 3 weeks, it was in the news almost every day. There was the governor of Florida said he believed in dunking the corn pone on scriptural grounds, preferably a complete submersion. He was obviously a Baptist, right? And the governor of Oklahoma said it was crumbling for humans and dunking for dogs, or vice versa. I can't remember which. And somebody asked Emily Post what she thought about it, and she refused to take a stand. And Franklin Roosevelt, who claimed to be an adoptive Georgian because he's had that facility in Warm Springs.
Okay.
He jumped into the controversy and said that it should be referred to the Democratic National Convention Platform Committee. And then there was some French chef was asked about it, and he said pot liquor is atrocious, and he wanted to have a good hot argument with Huey about it. And years later, I think it was John Edges wrote a whole thesis on this pot liquor and corn pone controversy of 1931. And so it really was an interesting thing. And it lasted beyond the 3 weeks. When Huey got to the Senate in 1932, a lot of the senators gave him the cold shoulder. He was new. He was a freshman. They didn't know him. He didn't know them, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things he did was he had pot liquor added to the Senate menu.
Oh.
And then he staged a publicity thing where all the Southern senators got together to eat pot liquor and corn pone for lunch to eat it. And of course, there was a picture in the paper, and I think that helped break the ice in the Senate for him.
That's
and he
clever.
would serve it at various times thereafter. He once served it for a dinner of bankers or a lunch of bankers. I mean, he must have taken quite a secret delight in making a bunch of bankers. Can you see a bunch of bankers used to eating filet mignon, and all of a sudden, here's pot liquor for lunch, right? Get in touch with the people,
That's right, yeah.
So anyway.
Oh, my goodness. Well, it does kind of seem like a food by itself in Louisiana's religion, so I can understand how the debate kind of happened.
I finally had pot liquor at Mary Mac's Tea Room in Atlanta.
Okay.
So I was going to ask you if they have any places in Nashville that serve pot liquor. I would check out the restaurants.
I'll have to look. Not that
I know they didn't have it at the
seen.
Catbird seat.
No. One of my favorite places to eat is called Monell's. It's a family-style place that's here. I don't think I've ever seen them have it, but it's good country cooking. But I'll look. I know there's a book, too, now that I know of pot liquor. There's a book that is called The Pot Liquor Papers.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's great.
I haven't read it myself, but now I'm curious what that one's about. I think we had it as a Nashville Read book or something a couple of years ago, potentially, so I'm not sure, but now I'm curious.
in that campaign where the waiters dressed up in green pajamas, they also served pot liquor.
Oh, wow.
Of course, they had to. And he had other, publicity-type stunts. So he once flew a bartender from New Orleans up to New York City to teach the bartender there how to make a proper Ramus gin fizz.
Oh.
And you can still see newsreels of him. He had been on the wagon for a year and a half. And he said, look, I've been on the water wagon for a year and a half, but I'm going to sample this just to make sure that it's genuine, right? And, of course, he takes a sip and then says, I think that's all right. Better be sure about it. And then he takes another sip, of course, and everybody starts laughing. So he had that kind of publicity, too, and that was in 1935. And then, of course, his song, Every Man a King, would be performed. He had it performed by several singers, sometimes on the radio. And once you can still see some YouTube clips with Ina Ray Hutton, who was the first female band leader.
Oh, wow.
As Ina Ray Hutton and her Melodiers. And they would put on special shows for Huey at this particular hotel in Washington, D.C., but then he had them play this particular song that he had written, obviously in anticipation of a campaign.
Okay. Very good. Okay. Well, I guess getting into the part about Nashville's story.
Yeah.
So what is it that brought him here? And it was 1934, right?
1934. Yes. And it depends on how far back you want to go in terms of how he developed it. I suspect that he was influenced by Chicago Mayor William Hale Thompson.
Okay.
And back in 1928, he had visited New Orleans for a flood control conference because Chicago senators and representatives, cooperated with Louisiana congresspeople for flood control legislation. And Thompson had come down, the paper said, with 800 Chicagoans, well stocked with money, and a big brass band. And I think he made a big impression on Huey. And in 1932, he had traveled with the band to Houston to watch LSU play Rice University. They had lost. He had a plan to go to West Point in 1931, I think it was, but he couldn't get the lieutenant governor to go along with him, and he didn't want to leave the state government in the lieutenant governor's hands, so he canceled that trip, or he sent the band on the trip, but he didn't go with them. So I think then he had, in 1933, I think Vanderbilt had played LSU here, or in any event, somehow Huey promised his friend Dan McGugan, the athletic director of Vanderbilt, that he would have a big crowd for the 1934 game. And Huey had fired a football coach, Russ Cohen, who had then gotten a position at Vanderbilt. And I think that while he was fired, I don't think there were terrible feelings between the two. He honored him in part by coming up for that trip. So I think he started out saying, well, I'll show him a good turnout. I'll bring the band and the cadet corps. And then I think what happened is he had to take a step back, he had some terrible defeats in January of 1934 and April of 1934. The New Orleans mayor had defeated his candidate, and in April of 1934, congressmen had defeated Huey's endorsed candidate. But in September of 1934, he had a huge comeback victory. He elected 2 congressmen in the New Orleans district and a judge, and it was just a rout. People were disgusted with the corruption that he had uncovered in New Orleans, and he had broadcast radio speeches detailing it. And he had this spectacular victory. Some called it the greatest victory of his political career. So I think he was kind of on a manic phase of these victories in part. And then, he remembered the 1931 failed West Point trip, and he just decided that he could get this done. And he was a showman. He was a natural showman. And so he eventually just decided to take the whole student body. Anybody who wanted to borrow $7, $6 for the train fare, and $1 to eat, he would go. And so he's sitting there announcing this at the LSU campus, and all the students are cheering and going berserk. And so he says anybody who needs to borrow the money can come up and borrow the money, and he empties his pockets. Then the people with him, he said, "You empty your pockets." Then he had a suitcase brought from his hotel with cash, and he distributed out more loans. People followed him back to his hotel and followed him to obtain more loans. And so he finally, it took 5 special trains, and he took all the students to Nashville.
Oh, wow.
Now, he had negotiated a special railroad fare. They quoted him a higher price, but he said, "Now, look, we're going to start assessing your bridges."
Ooh.
And so they decided, let's go along with this. Let's make the best of it. And they decorated the cars with "Hurrah for Huey" and other festive signs and so on. Mm-hmm. So it really caught on like wildfire, both in Louisiana and then in Nashville. Because if you follow the Nashville papers, right, first it was going to be 1,000 people, then it was 3,000 people, then 5,000. Then the largest peacetime excursion in history was going to come to Nashville. And then you had the other details of how he arranged the trip. Because I think he was very concerned. He wanted to make sure that there was no drinking. And that was part of his announcement to the kids. No drinking. I don't even want to smell it.
Oh, smart.
And he said, "I'm going to have 25 state troopers enforcing these edicts. We're going to be well behaved." And then the Attorney General of Tennessee refused to let the Louisiana troopers carry firearms in Tennessee. And so Huey somehow contacted the game warden of Tennessee, and the game warden said he would issue wildlife game licenses, would let them carry firearms in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And he had a kind of a wit. He said, "You can guard whatever wildlife you see fit."
AKA LSU students.
Right. Exactly. And so he got around that obstacle as well. And so these 5 special trains pulled into Nashville. Huey got a permit to lead a parade. And the UCLA Film Library still has some clips of part of that parade.
Look into that.
Which was interesting. And then Huey conducted a concert in the park before the game. And then, of course, they had the game. Huey spoke at halftime from a sound truck, but kept his remarks fairly brief and thanking the crowd for the reception that he received. And then they returned by way of Vicksburg. So Nashville, 80,000 people turned out. I mean, it was the biggest crowd since President McKinley had visited in like 1903 or something. So it was just a huge event. And I think people were very impressed with Huey. They wanted to see him with LSU. One person called it his hobby, right? They wanted to see Huey with his hobby, LSU, and so they all turned out to do it. Then when they returned by way of Vicksburg, and they had a parade in Vicksburg.
Oh, wow.
And the Vicksburg people turned out for the parade. And at one point, a mule carrying a block of ice, the ice fell off the back of it. It skidded between Huey's legs. Huey picked up the block of ice, carried it ran it to the ice wagon, and the crowd went berserk, thinking that he had just awed the people and, indicated that he was a football fan and could carry it like a halfback around the end. So they were just awestruck. And I think he had a sense of showmanship that was unique for that time. You can argue, I don't know whether a similar act would have the similar effect today because we have so many more amusements.
Sure.
But if you think yourself back into the Depression and the lack of entertainment that people had access to, something like a parade was big. And something like a train carrying a big band of 125 pieces, that was a huge band for that time.
Yeah.
And so that was impressive. And so you're looking at people looking for an excuse to get out from their everyday humdrum life, and these things were big.
Right. I don't think obviously this didn't actually happen, but wasn't another part of the rumor of him coming was to announce his candidacy to be president or
Absolutely.
to run for president?
Yes,
Yeah.
There were rumors to that effect, but he did not do it.
I wonder why he chose not to.
I think this was still in the nascent phases of the share our wealth movement. He got to the Senate in 1932, but was frequently absent. Then in 1933, when Roosevelt took office, he was very active in the Senate. And he, of course, was indispensable to Roosevelt's nomination at the Chicago Convention in 1932. and he had campaigned for Roosevelt in North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and so on. So he was active pursuing progressive legislation. But he was disappointed at the conservative aspects of the early New Deal. Roosevelt cut veterans' benefits. He cut scientific research. He issued a banking piece of legislation that only rescued federal banks, not the state banks, until Huey advocated for the state banks, and then Roosevelt acquiesced. And then Roosevelt was hostile to the idea of insuring bank deposits. And Huey and Vandenberg and some other senators forcefully advocated that, and ultimately Roosevelt acquiesced in that. And some say that's the most successful piece of the early New Deal, and it's a result of Huey and other progressive senators' advocacy, not Roosevelt, even though typically Roosevelt gets the credit. Oh, we insured bank deposits under the New Deal. Well, wait a minute, you really didn't.
Yeah.
But Huey, despite criticizing Roosevelt's legislation or seeking to improve it, as with the Banking Act, he hadn't broken with Roosevelt. He kept urging Roosevelt, share our wealth, tax the wealthy. Come on, propose something, please. And he had started in February of 1934 the Share Our Wealth Societies. But I don't know what conception he had of those societies at that time. He might have viewed it as a pressure group designed to force Roosevelt to acknowledge the tremendous organizing success that Huey had had with that and to start taxing the wealth and just redistributing it. So he had started the Share Our Wealth Societies in February of 1934, and they had grown to about 4.5 million members at the end of 1934. So it really spread like wildfire. But he hadn't broken with Roosevelt. But at the end of 1934, Roosevelt indicted some of his closest allies, and they had a trial where several of them were ultimately convicted of income tax problems. And so it was in January 1935 that Huey first broke irrevocably with Roosevelt, and it was clear after that time that he was going to try to defeat Roosevelt in 1936, whether by becoming a candidate himself or backing someone else. So what I think is that by fall of 1934, he hadn't quite decided yet whether to break with Roosevelt, and so he didn't announce his candidacy. And I think he was in some ways cautious. I mean, I say that he risked everything in a variety of ways, but he was cautious. He hadn't decided at the time he was assassinated. He hadn't decided yet, I don't think, what he was going to do. He had several plans in mind, but I think he was going to tour the West and the Midwest in the fall of 1935 and sound out sentiment before deciding what to do. So I think that the football game in Nashville was part of a test of his appeal. And he certainly must have been gratified by the turnout, but he hadn't quite decided whether he was going to throw down with Roosevelt at that particular time.
All right. You mentioned in the book, too, that he had told his wife his career path, and running for president was in there somewhere, but I see what you're saying now, though. He kind of was planning it out to see.
Yes. He had told
made sense.
He had told his
Strategy.
wife, the exact time I don't know, but he told his wife that he was going to run for a secondary state office, then win the governorship, then become a United States senator, and then become president. And it's a weird kind of comment to make. And Williams, who interviewed Huey's widow and got that comment from her, said she kind of shivered slightly as she was recalling this because he was measuring it all, even as a young man.
Yeah. Well, he had big plans, for sure.
He did. He also had a sense of his own mortality, too, though, because several times he said things like, if I live long enough, I will do this. And if I live long enough, I will do that. It was very surprising, the number of times he said something like that.
He knew.
I wonder.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sad, but it's interesting. Well, one thing I was like, maybe I'm missing the mark on this going back to the part where you were talking about how he wanted to bring the armed troopers up with the students.
Yeah.
I think you actually answered the question by saying this, but I was like, why did he feel the need for them to be armed? Well, I guess is it to protect the students, or because I was like, what was the need for them to bring, I guess, guns with them? I don't know if I'm just don't understand the time frame, or I don't know.
You understand the time frame.
Yeah.
And, you can argue that guns might not have been necessary, but he just wanted to make sure that his students stayed proper during their trip, because obviously if something got out of hand, he'd get the blame for that. And I think that there was a lot of talk or newspaper stories afterwards that people were very impressed at how well behaved the LSU students were.
Oh, good. So it wasn't
So
really
I think
necessary.
that redounded to his benefit that, hey, not only was this his school, but they were well-behaved, proper persons, and there to have a good time, but not to be wild.
Yeah, keep him in line.
Yeah.
Did he stay in town more than 24 hours, or how long was he here?
I don't think so. They stayed in Murfreesboro
Okay.
the night before the game, I think, and then they returned. And I'm not sure exactly if they had to how long the stop in Vicksburg was, right? But it was obviously long enough to have a parade and to awe the population there. But I don't know. I think they had to sit up a night on the train to return home.
Oh, wow. Ooh, I wonder how long of a train ride that was, all the way from Baton Rouge to Nashville. I don't know.
It's hard to conceptualize those kinds of things. I had to look up. There was some sort of website I figured out how long it would take to go from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. by train, and it was like 24 hours.
Oh, wow.
And you change trains in Atlanta, I think, typically, and boom. So, it's hard to get a handle on those logistics at the time. But remember, there weren't very many airplanes at the time. It was only in like July 1935 that Huey took a plane from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to land at that new airport that they had built there. And another senator from New Mexico had been killed in a plane crash in May of 1935. And so it was kind of a new industry. Roosevelt had tried to support symbolically the airline industry in the 1932 convention when he announced that he would accept the nomination in person and would fly from New York to the Chicago convention to do so. And some plane delays actually caused the convention to have to be extended one day so that they could hear his acceptance speech.
Okay, very good. So here, less than 24 hours, but enough to really wow the crowds. And that makes me wonder, being a Vandy fan, I understand how it is when other teams come to the game. So it sounds like there were more LSU fans than Vandy fans at the game.
I wonder. I mean, LSU won the game, but they were favored to win the game, even though both teams were undefeated.
Right, that's right. Yeah, the previous year they had tied. Is that correct? I remember reading that, I think.
I had forgotten that, so that's interesting. But that wouldn't surprise me. And they played in Baton Rouge?
I believe so.
Okay.
I think so.
So that makes sense why Huey would promise him a good turnout the next year.
I was kind of wondering what inspired him to make that trip, but I think, again, you answered that earlier pretty much, is he was looking for a couple of things. One, to be a showman, and then also just seeing how being a showman would help his potential career. So what was the general consensus of not only newspapers but Nashvillians when they first heard of his plans to come to Nashville for this game? It kind of seemed like they eventually grew to being excited for it, but was that always the case?
I think at the beginning it was like, oh, okay, Huey's going to bring 1,000 people. Yeah, great, Then all of a sudden, as it expanded, and then as the stories, like how he negotiated the railroad rate, that's kind of interesting. And then the expansion, they were going to have a parade. And then how he got permission from the Wildlife Commission, right? And all of a sudden, it was like this big event. And when you call something the largest peacetime excursion in history, you can imagine that it would catch the imagination of some people.
Yeah, that's true.
Huey was a huge LSU fan. There's another story that one writer says is apocryphal, and it might be. But in that same year, the ticket sales for one of their early games was off. And so, and this was a game that was going to be held in Baton Rouge. So Huey figured out why. It was that the Barnum and Bailey Circus was going to appear on the same date.
Oh.
And so there was a law that was passed several years earlier about dipping cattle to eliminate ticks.
Huh.
It was a tick eradication law. Nobody knows about that law now, but it was a big thing back then because farmers hated the expense of having to dip their cattle.
Yeah.
But the experts wanted those ticks eliminated, right? So you had this tick eradication law. So Huey calls up the Barnum and Bailey Circus, according to the story, and says, look, the way I'm reading this law is you're going to have to dip your elephant and quarantine him for 3 weeks.
Wow.
Did you ever dip a tiger? So Barnum and Bailey decided to switch the order of New Orleans and Baton Rouge in their presentation, and the LSU had a good turnout for their game.
Wow, he had a way with words, didn't he?
Well, it's poignant that there was a writer in New York who wrote about both of these incidents, And I think he was horrified, that Huey would impose himself on a private company in that way. And he said, somebody that can accomplish those kinds of things, meaning the changing the circus date and going to Nashville, is either going to become president or get shot.
Oh, wow.
And this was in 1934. So it was an interesting, weird perspective. I think somebody like that took things a little too seriously. This was a one-time thing, and people had a good time, and it was good for Nashville, and it was good for Louisiana.
Right.
It was good for Huey, but it was good for LSU too. So
there was an article that Vanderbilt wrote back, I think in 2005, or it was published somewhere at the university about this event. But I'm curious if Vandy or LSU fans know anything about this phenomenon or this event at all now. If not,
if they would read my book.
They will now, yeah. And listen to this podcast, yeah. But that was quite something. I had not heard of it beforehand, so I was like, oh, well, that's fascinating. That's quite something. You're right. Football is it's a different thing now. It's a whole different animal. So I'm curious if something like that would happen today, how it would be.
Yeah, the logistics would be totally different because, the population of LSU was, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people
right
at the time. Now it's, 80, 100,000, whatever.
I was wondering what the population of the school at the time would have been if every single student ended up coming to the game, or if that's what the totality of the 7,000 was, or if there were a few that were like, nah, I'll pass.
I'm sure there were a few that passed, but I'm sure that there were a few townsmen who impersonated a student to get the $7 loan and to be able to accompany the school to the game.
In the book, you wrote that a couple of the students came back again for the $7 loan.
There were a lot of students named Smith and Jones who got these loans.
Oh, man. Bless Huey for doing that. I wonder how much of the loan he got back.
Yeah, they made stories that he got the loans back, but I bet you he sustained a loss. They had a warning after the first day of giving out things. They said, now, look, anybody found impersonating someone to get a loan, is going to face consequences. And some people returned the money after that, but I don't know how many.
Oh, well, I guess it was kind of more so for the trip and the experience, less of getting the money back. So at least based on all the other things that he used his own funding for over the years, kind of doesn't seem like that was his priority. But,
right.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned in the book he was considering doing another trip back to Tennessee whenever LSU was going to be playing the University of Tennessee. But
in Knoxville.
I guess you'll have to remind me what the reason that he decided not to do that.
What had happened is that one of the Knoxville newspapers said it was ballyhoo.
Oh.
And therefore he said, if they don't want me to come, I won't come. But I don't know if I put this in the book or not. But either the Department of Commerce or the university or somebody kept writing to Huey, look, it was a nationally syndicated columnist who said that. It was just appeared in our paper. It wasn't us. We want you to come.
Oh.
Don't listen to just because one nationally syndicated columnist wrote about it. Don't take offense. We didn't mean any offense. Blah blah blah. But Huey didn't change his mind. Of course, then LSU went to Knoxville and lost. They lost the game in Knoxville.
Oh no.
So that was the season ended up being a huge disappointment. At the time of the Vanderbilt game, they were riding high. And Huey had said, we'll play the two other best teams in the country on the same day. He was so confident. And he said, the Rose Bowl better get their name in the pot damn quick if they want us to come out to the Rose Bowl. Well, then they lose in Knoxville, and they lost to Tulane by 1 point in a very dramatic game. Where their star player was carried off in a stretcher.
Oh, no.
One, I think it was an LSU fan, had a heart attack in the game.
Oh, wow.
And so, somebody else fainted. I mean, it was, it was just that kind of a game.
Oh, wow.
And you kind of wonder if you know All the King's Men. And one of the things in that novel was that the governor's stepson, Tom Stark, was a football star and got injured, permanently injured, in a football game. And you have to wonder whether the inspiration for that was this Tulane game where, the star player was carried off on a stretcher.
Maybe.
And, people had heart attacks and fainted and stuff like that. And it was a very close game. So you have to wonder whether that kind of found its way, metamorphosized somehow into the novel All the King's Men.
Admittedly, I've not read the book or seen the movie. I was planning on watching it, though, so I'll have to look for that. But I would imagine so. That makes sense to me, yeah.
You haven't read a novel by Vanderbilt's favorite son?
I know. I'm a terrible Vandy fan.
I still get emails from the Robert Penn Warren Center. I haven't gone to any of their events, but it's quite a substantial amount of programming and very impressive.
Oh, wow. He was in the Ken Burns documentary. I was surprised. I didn't know when he had passed away, so I was like, oh, how old is this documentary? I'm not sure, but no, it's on my list to read for sure. 'Cause it's
The documentary by Burns was in the mid-1980s, and I don't remember when Robert Penn Warren died. Remember, he left after Huey died. Huey's heirs lost the 1940 election.
Okay.
And LSU then retrenched, which is the total opposite path that Huey had set it on. And Robert Penn Warren got an offer, I forget, from Minnesota or Michigan or someplace, and LSU wouldn't match the $200 increase in salary that this other university had offered him. And then he eventually left that university, went to Yale, and then, he was a poet laureate of the United States. I mean, and LSU, without Huey, lost this substantially, this professor who had really revolutionized quite a bit of the college teaching about poetry and understanding fiction and things like that.
I wonder what inspired Robert Penn Warren to write that novel. See, that's the history I don't also know. So I don't know if you have any idea on that one.
I have a few, because he's written about it. The Matrix of Experience is one article he wrote about it, where he said, look, Willie Stark was his own character, but obviously if he had never been to LSU, he wouldn't have written this novel.
Oh, okay.
He had written, I think it was designed to be a play in the late 30s, and he was dissatisfied with it. And he put it aside, put it in the desk drawer. And then somehow he got the idea that what it was missing was like a narrator. The play had like kind of a chorus, but he thought it would be stronger with a narrator and as a novel. And he was over in Italy, in the northern part of I want to say Perugia, but I'm not 100% sure that's right. And he's sitting under olive trees and stuff, and in the shadow of Mussolini.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And he rewrote the novel, and then it was published a few years later. And he said it was the original name of the politician was not Willie Stark, as it is now in the novel. It was Talos, Talos.
Oh.
And Talos was the bronze man of, I think, Greek mythology. Kind of a remorseless automaton in favor of justice. And I've tried to struggle through Spencer's book 5 of Fairy Queen, and Talos plays a prominent role in that. And they even have a little section about redistributing wealth or distributing justice in Fairy Queen. So, I think that had something to do with Robert Penn Warren's book.
Okay.
At least if you think about it, right? Why would you name something Talos after the bronze man of Greek mythology? I think he guarded the island of Crete or something like that.
Okay.
But he features prominently in the Fairy Queen, book 5.
Okay.
So.
Oh, well, there you go. Now I know. Well, sadly, if his life had not been cut short, which I don't know if you want to kind of provide our listeners with the background of what happened to Huey Long, I'm curious what his future might have looked like.
Yeah. So in 1935, in January, he had broken with Franklin Roosevelt, and it was pretty clear that he was going to try to defeat Roosevelt somehow in 1936. Either by running himself as a third-party ticket or backing someone else or defeating Roosevelt in the primaries. That hadn't been decided. There were a lot of variables there, so we don't really know. In 1935, he had completed, through a series of special legislative sessions, his takeover of local government. And that's usually pointed to as evidence of his dictatorial tendencies, that he wanted to dictate New Orleans city government and Baton Rouge's city government and so on. Now, at the time, it wasn't quite as unusual as you might think, because the law was that municipalities were creatures of the state government. And so the state government could define or expand their roles, limit it, expand it, whatever. It was by law. It's called Dillon's Rule.
Okay.
The rule went back to something like 1868,
wow.
and Dillon was the name of the judge. So that's why you have these home rule constitutional provisions that have been enacted since then in most states. Like Illinois in 1970 had a home rule provision added to the Constitution, and that's what lets local governments do some things on their own without waiting for the state legislature to authorize them. Okay. So anyway, in 1935, Huey had a series of special legislative sessions. He had taken over the government of New Orleans, taken over all the patronage that these local governments had. And he was obviously preparing to consolidate his hold on Louisiana so he could go evangelize other states. So he had a special legislative session set for September of 1935. And one of the bills there was going to gerrymander That's kind of a timely topic.
Yeah.
He's going to gerrymander a political opponent out of his position. But otherwise, the legislative session was proceeding smoothly, and Huey had come up for that session. But when one of the Sunday night session was concluding, Huey strode out into the corridor, and the son-in-law of the judge who was going to get gerrymandered stepped out from behind a pillar, pulled a pistol, and shot him. And Huey's bodyguard and another ally were sitting there, and they kind of hit at his arm. So it deflected it downward, but he shot in his lower right abdomen. Oof. And Huey staggered down the stairs, and met another ally at the bottom of the stairs. And then they flagged down a state trooper and had him taken to the hospital. And Huey saying, "Geez, I wonder why he shot me." And, of course, the bodyguards went berserk, and this assassin, Dr. Carl Austin Weiss, was a very well-regarded ear, nose, and throat specialist. He had traveled in Europe, studied medicine there, and had a really bright future ahead of him. And he had a little baby. Aww. He just recently married, had a little baby. He had every reason to live.
Yeah.
So the issue of the motive, which we'll come back to in a second, but that still remains a puzzle because he had so much to live for.
Yeah.
But after he shot Huey said, "I'm shot," and he staggered off. The bodyguards wrestled with him and then shot him. One of the bodyguards said he shot him and saw the bullet enter his face. But the bodyguards went insane after that, and they shot multiple times more than that, even while he was laying inert on the floor, and they just kept shooting him. So he had something like 25 bullet holes in him, 61 holes or something like that. Oof. And when they lifted his body up, some of the bullets clanked on the floor. I mean, it was awful. It was really awful. So then 2 days later, Huey died at 4:06 a.m. on Tuesday morning. There is a suggestion that the operation that was conducted on Huey was inopportune. The doctor who operated opened him from the front and sewed up a couple of tears, but it seemed like there wasn't a big problem. But he hadn't felt the kidney or inserted a catheter to check the kidney, and people think that there was blood in the kidney, that the bullet had gone through and hit a renal duct and hit the kidney, and so he was bleeding internally from the kidney. Yeah. And so if he had discovered that, he might have been able to kill the kidney but save Huey, right? Tie off the kidney and still save him. Yeah. But he didn't catch that. Some people say it was just a blood clot and it wasn't bleeding at that time, or he might have died from an infection anyway. It's hard. It's all disputed. But nevertheless, one doctor who came in later got into an argument with the surgeon and then stalked off saying, "He's your patient, not mine," and left. So clearly there was some disagreement among the doctors about what should be done. Oh. And so the maximum wasn't done, not maybe on purpose, but just by accident. Yeah. So Huey died. Now, everybody, the alternate history buffs would love to know what would have happened. But, man, there's so many variables that it's hard to judge. True. We tend to revere Franklin Roosevelt now because he was 4 terms and got us through World War II and got us through the Great Depression and blah, blah, blah. But he was a politician at the time. I mean, he had his detractors. He had his detractors on the left. I mean, the left thought he was a cautious, middle-of-the-road, the check which way the wind is blowing politician. I mean, so he didn't really back Social Security until he got worried about Huey. He didn't really support increasing tax rates on the rich until Huey threatened his reelection in 1935. And that's the famous Second New Deal of 1935 was caused by Huey's advocacy. Yeah. So the left were somewhat dissatisfied with Roosevelt. And, of course, conservatives thought he was a communist or worse. And therefore, it's hard to judge now when we look back and he's this revered figure. You wonder how could he have been defeated? But, Churchill had this heroic leadership in Great Britain in World War II. In the first election after the war, he got defeated. Yeah, that's true. I mean, what? Yeah. Right? How do you justify that? So people are fickle. So we don't really know what would have happened. But we don't know what would have happened with respect to the Republicans. Would they have still nominated Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who was kind of a Me Too New Dealer? I mean, or would they have drafted someone more substantial or with a bigger reputation, but maybe a more conservative outlook if they thought Huey was going to split the liberal vote? with Roosevelt. So we don't really know what the Republicans would have done,
Yeah.
and we don't know whether Huey had reached a tipping point in his efforts to develop dislike of Roosevelt. I don't think Huey was at the point. This is just a judgment call. I could be totally wrong. Where people had turned against Roosevelt. I think it was tottering at that point. I think they were thinking, because Huey, is he crude? Is he unrealistic? Is he a Southerner? Is he this, that, and the other? I don't think they had clearly decided, okay, Huey's the man to put things right. And I don't think they had decided that Roosevelt was the guy we have to deep six because he's not getting it done.
Yeah.
But I think they were on the edge of that. Roosevelt's popularity had declined to an estimated 50%, which is high compared to now, but it was the lowest point of his presidency to date.
Oh, wow.
And his political director had in April commissioned a poll. It was a very crude poll, but it showed that Huey's popularity could tip the balance to Republicans in key states enough to make Roosevelt lose the election. And so Roosevelt, in response, increased relief expenditures, not in those states where Huey was strongest, but in those states where Huey might tip the balance to the Republicans. So it was a very crafty reallocation of relief expenditures, but it was clearly done, or at least the social scientists who studied this opine, that it was clearly done to reduce the threat that Huey would defeat Roosevelt in 1936.
Oh, my. Curious how, with the war and whatnot, if he had not have been assassinated, where his career might have turned.
That's a really good question, too, because he was an isolationist, as were many in the aftermath of World War I, when people felt we didn't secure democracy, we just enriched people, the arms manufacturers. There were all these inquiries into the arms manufacturers' profits, and people didn't want to get involved in Europe's problems. And Huey was an isolationist in 1935, no question about that. But so was George Norris, so was Robert La Follette, Burton Wheeler. A lot of progressives were isolationists at that period of time. And a lot of Republicans in the western states were isolationists also. William Randolph Hearst was an isolationist. But some of those people changed their minds between 1936 and 1940. And so there's an unknown there with respect to Huey, right? Because he did read and study a lot, and he did develop. And so and there were isolationists who changed their mind. So I don't know what he would have done. You can imagine a scenario where he defeats Roosevelt in 1936 and a Republican refuses to aid Great Britain and allows Hitler to be more successful than he was. You can imagine a situation where a Republican gets elected in 1936 and ramps up war spending, if an East Coast Republican as opposed to a West Coast Republican, right? Ramps up the war spending, and the Depression gets alleviated because of the war spending, and therefore, eliminates Huey's issues from contention. So you can imagine that. You can also imagine that Huey defeats Roosevelt in 1936, an isolationist Republican wins, the Depression gets worse, and by 1940, Huey's appeal looks unbeatable, and he gets elected in 1940.
All kinds of ideas.
One other thing about this isolationism business is what impressed me about looking at Huey's life was that he concentrated his focus on the job he had at hand. So when he was railroad commissioner, he focused on what the railroad commission could do. And when he was governor, he focused on what the governor could do. In fact, in the 1928 presidential campaign, he basically didn't care who the Democrats nominated, and they sent a delegation over to the convention, which was, I think, in Houston, but he stayed home in Baton Rouge to work. He sent his wife with the delegation to go over there, and some of his other leaders. He didn't ignore it completely. But when his leader called him and said, hey, we want to back Al Smith, it might be good to stand in with a future president, Huey said, the hell with the president. You tell him to vote for Smith. He wanted his delegation seated, and Smith could help him do that, but he didn't really care. And so he concentrated on the governorship. And then when he took the Senate position, he had a period where he studied economics books and history books and things like that because he wasn't well-versed on national issues. So if you take this huge, fantastical leap and say he was president in 1936, some miracle, which I don't think is likely, but let's talk about it. I think he would have concentrated from 1936 to 1940 on getting the United States out of the Great Depression and implementing a share our wealth plan. But then whether he would have stopped there and ignored the rest of the world is kind of contrary to how he approached his career as he went along. And there are even stories that he fought Standard Oil in South America. So he gave speeches in support of Paraguay in their war with Bolivia because he said Bolivia was motivated by helping Standard Oil. So if he was an isolationist, why is he getting involved in Paraguay's fight with Bolivia? But you can see that maybe if corporations or rich people were going to dominate the world, maybe his share our wealth plan would have to expand to encompass worldwide influence.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a long chat.
It's a good answer.
Mainly a filibuster with no good answer at the end, right? 'Cause the answer at the end is I don't know. But you can see the different factors coming into play.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. And I guess it kind of brings us sort of all the way back to the beginning, really, and wraps things up, because we could keep talking forever about this. But is there anything else you kind of any other thoughts you want to leave listeners with of maybe an inspiration to read the book, or anything else anything you learned along the way?
Well, I think that whether you're on the left wing or the right wing, you could profit by reading the book because of the analysis of how Huey framed the issues and how he mobilized support and then executed his program. So I think that that could warrant somebody's attention. I think there's a variety of other people who might be interested in the book, like business managers. You look at his management or leadership techniques. It would be interesting to compare and contrast them with what's going on in the business world. I quote some advertising books because Huey's promotional campaigns followed the advertising principles that were current at the time, and I thought that was interesting and surprising to me. I would say if there was one thing to leave readers with, it would be that Huey, despite all that you've heard that's negative, he was a progressive thinker. And we have issues today about taxing the rich. We have issues today about providing a minimum income per families. We have issues today about making college education affordable. And those are all Huey's issues. And his philosophy on the supply of money and on public works programs were more modern than Roosevelt or anybody else in the establishment had at the time. So he was ahead of his time. I mean, if you look today, the monetary theorists, their hero is Milton Friedman, right? A very conservative fellow, but said that the supply of money is the key. Huey said that in the early 1930s. Said, let's increase the supply of money. He's not the only one who said it, but he was one of those who said it. And there's a economist that I quote in the book who said fiscal policy, it didn't work in the 1930s because it wasn't tried, right? You needed massive public works expenditures to get us out of the Great Depression. And that was Huey's plan, to have massive public. So you're looking at this guy and you think, oh, he's from the backwoods of Louisiana, oh, he's from Hick or this or that, demagogic, so on. But you look at his actual ideas and they were very progressive and they still resonate today. So I think that's probably, if I had to boil it down to one thing, I would say he was not a nostalgic, backwards-looking, prehistoric, populist type guy. He was actually, whatever the needs he had in the moment for politics, no question he had them. No question he played politics hard. But he, sometimes out of that comes some smart ideas, and I think that's what he had.
Very good. All right. Well, I guess the thing I'll leave everyone with is just go read the book.
Oh, thank you.
For sure. And again, the title of it is American Populist, Huey Long of Louisiana. I want to thank our guests for joining us today and thank our listeners for listening.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.